everybody can hear me and everybody can see. But
you're good.
So folks, as Suzanne alluded to, I'm not a biologist, I'm not a botanist. That means I'm not going to tell you anything difference between two species based on how many veins the stamen has, because I don't give a damn about any of that. What I'm excited about is when I see a plant, I kind of want to know, why is that plant there? I take a lot of family groups out on nature walks, and the parents have good intentions, but all they see is a big green mess. And so I feel it's important for people to understand what's with this plant. Why is it here? What's its story? And that's what excites me. As you get into it, you'll find out that everything has a story. Everything's where it is, and there's a reason for that. And that leads you to something that I've apparently become notorious for saying, which is plants ain't stupid. So let's talk about one that you see every day. You walk out of your house and there's a pine tree, big whoop. Well, actually, almost everything you see down here are a loblolly pine. And they didn't used to be that common. Actually, when the Europeans arrived here, longleaf pines stretched all over, covered the Atlantic coast. The poor little loblolly was sort of the poor cousin, and it had to stay in the swamps and in the bogs and in the places that the majestic longleaf pine didn't want to go. So the loblolly was kind of a second-rate cousin in the pine family. But the Europeans did a good job. Within 100 years, they had cut down almost all of the longleaf pines, and the loblolly filled the gap. How it did that, there's a clue. The name is a clue. If you think about it, loblolly is a pretty stupid name. Actually, what it is a bastardization of an Irish Scots term for a porridge bowl. A bowl of porridge, hot porridge. When the Scots-Irish arrived in the New World, the English had already taken all of the prime farmland and the uplands, and the poor immigrants kind of went into the swamps and the bogs. And that's where they found the loblolly pine. It's a great plant to have if you're taking smart aleck kids around. Most of us know about DNA. The DNA is the code in any living creature that tells its cells how to replicate. The more DNA, the more information. In 2014, they sequenced the genome of the loblolly, and it's about 21.15 billion pairs. That's a huge genome. In fact, you can turn around to the punk teenager and tell him it's 7 times longer than his code. So this plant has tons of library to help it survive just about anywhere and makes it very adaptable. So when you sit here and say, well, that's just a plain old ordinary pine tree, no, that's a creature that has a code that will allow it to exist in swamps and deserts and just about everywhere. In fact, now it's been exported and it's been growing in plantations in places as far away as Alaska. So that plant's not stupid. Here's one you will probably walk down the street and see, a big old glossy southern magnolia. It's evergreen, it's pretty. And you probably noticed the leaves are real thick and, whoa, look at that flower, smells great. What's different about it? Every flower that you pick up is very tannic, except the magnolia. The magnolia flower and the leaves are tough, they're thick. So that should get you thinking, why? What's different about this plant? What's different is the magnolia is probably the oldest flowering plant still existent. They've got fossilized remains of this same species that are 95 million years old. That explains the heavy flower and the thick leaves. It's pollinated by beetles and by flies. And that's because the other pollinators didn't come along until 25 million years after this flower came along. So even though you might see a bee or a butterfly on a magnolia, it's not doing the work. It's flies and beetles. And they're rough on flowers, so the plant, not being stupid, grew to be tough so it could handle the traffic from big animals like beetles. So beautiful plant, beautiful flowers, but there's a reason that it's the way it is. Oh, a lot of my Gulf Coast friends probably get down by the creek some, or all of us up here in the piney woods certainly do, and we find willow trees. A lot of people think a willow is just sort of a trash tree. Nothing could be further from the fact. You find them around the water, you find them in wet places, but let's take a look at the willow leaf. Oh, I do have to apologize for the pictures here. In addition to not being a biologist or not being a botanist, I'm also not a photographer. So 90% of the pictures you see, I just lifted straight off the internet. So I don't make any claim to it, and I won't use them for commercial purposes, I promise. But look at a willow leaf. It sure looks different. And think about where it lives. If it's on the side of a creek in Texas, it's going to get flooded. And those floods are going to come through with high velocity. If it had a big clunky leaf, it'd get swept off and carried downstream. These little thin leaves allow it to let the flood water pass through and the plant's unharmed. So that's pretty cool. But what's even more interesting to me about this plant is its history with people. Native Americans used it for all sorts of purposes, but chiefly for medicines. They could shred up the wood and use it to pack wounds. They used it to make extracts for headaches, what used to be called female disorders, urinary tract infections. It's got a compound in it that is extremely close chemically to the compound in aspirin. So you can make an extract out of the willow and take it, and it will do a really good job on headaches and fevers. So it's a very useful medicinal plant. Another cool thing about it is because it so commonly grows very well in wetlands and such, it's used heavily in restoration and urban control projects where people are trying to stabilize stream beds and new ponds. And it's actually been shown to have a pretty good use on extracting heavy metals, poisonous organic compounds out of soils and helping with photosynthesis to degrade them. So it's actually used in restoration projects fairly heavily. And all that from a stupid little plant that looks all straggly and is laying by the side of the stream. So there's a few of your neighbors. Oh, by the way, as we get to the question and answer period, if you ask a question, even though I'm not a trained expert, I'll give you an answer, because even better than that, I'm a grandfather. And we all know grandfathers know everything. Oh, here's a pretty one, a little cherry laurel, which I obviously stole off of Texas Tech's website. You find cherry laurels planted as ornamentals in a lot of yards. You find them out in the woods here and there. They were planted very heavily in Texas as an ornamental in the 1900s. There was a huge drought in 1950, and it weakened them, and they were infected by some sort of borer, and so they kind of got wiped out in Texas, and the ones that have come back are just sort of the leftovers. But you'll see them in the woods occasionally in areas, and they're just a real pretty glossy tree. Here's the leaves. Look at how nice that is. And that looks like that most of the time, with one little exception. I've got a little chewed up piece here because deer doesn't, deer do not browse on them. Very few things bother this tree. And now, because you're a highly trained outdoors person, you're going to say, gee, how come when everything else around here is getting chewed up and eaten up, this little cherry laurel just looks so happy? Well, it's got a defense mechanism. Those pretty little green leaves and the branches have a chemical compound in them, which I will totally destroy, but it's hydrocyanic acid. Basically, when these leaves are broken up, and particularly if they're chewed and eaten by mammals like deer or human, it creates a chemical compound which you might know as cyanide poison. Another clue to that is if you take the leaves, crush them up, and you ask somebody to smell it, the smell will be either identified as a maraschino cherry or an almond sort of smell, which, because you watched every James Bond movie ever made, you know that means cyanide poisoning. Remember when the bad guy was rolling around on the floor, foaming at the mouth, and James smelled and said, ah, almonds. So the cherry laurel, it's a pretty ornamental. If you tell this story and you have kids, the kids will immediately try and chew it. This picture doesn't really show you the tree, the sassafras tree, and that's because you can almost never see it out in the woods. It's a little crooked. They do become huge, but that's rare and far between. Mostly you'll recognize sassafras when you get close because it's got the goofy looking little leaves. Now the leaves can be one-lobed, two-lobed, but there's not many plants that I know of that have that big goofy three-lobed leaf. The sassafras is an incredibly interesting plant. When the Europeans got to the Atlantic coast, it was really common. They found that the natives, again, used it for tons of medicinal purposes. It's got a compound called saffrol oil in it. That's used to treat wounds, fevers, again, urinary problems, even used to treat acne. So the Europeans, the English particularly, discovered this and started shipping some of it back to the old country in England, where it became hugely popular in making a medicinal compound, because right then, about 1600, England was hit by a tremendous epidemic of venereal disease. And nothing will make a man buy medicine faster than venereal disease. So the English started shipping tons of sassafras back to England. In fact, it was second only to tobacco as an export out of the Americas. And it was so popular that by about 25 years later, it was almost wiped out. They couldn't find it. They could not make a 30-pound a year tax to the government. We've got it again. It's always grown down here. And in fact, this is what you use in your gumbo to make filet with. So your filet gumbo is based on a sassafras. And yes, if somebody here is even older than me, which I doubt, this was the original flavoring, the root extract in root beer. That went until about 1960 when the EPA discovered it was mildly carcinogenic, and they said, you know, we probably shouldn't put that in our soda pop. But not only is that a goofy plant, but it's got tons of interesting things and tons of North American history behind it. Oh, another terrible picture, the American holly. Again, it's an evergreen. You'll see it around here. Most of you know it from the leaves. This is what you can pay $300 to LL Bean to get a wreath made for your front door. The holly does well here I've seen some huge specimens because it likes wet soils, it likes shade. And again, it has a protection mechanism. As you all know, plus you can see, the holly leaf has a lot of sharp spines on it. That helps protect it from things like deer that might otherwise be inclined to browse on it. Now, that's well and good, but if you get curious the next time you're around some holly trees that are out in the woods, if they're next to a trail or the road or a path, take a minute and look at the leaves on the front, the leaves on the back, and see if you can see the leaves on the top. Trees ain't stupid. This plant stops making sharp, spiny edges on way up on the top where the deer can't reach it. Plus, it won't make as many spiny leaves on the side that's away from a trail where it's apt to encounter animals. Now, I don't mean that they're totally not there, but you can see a distinct difference in the thorniness of the plant on a side where the plant knows it could encounter animals or even humans. Plants don't waste energy because they ain't stupid. I like this picture mainly because I took it. Most of us love looking at groves of live oak trees. What I want you to do the next time you go out and you see a live oak grove is wonder why. What's with this tree? Why is it where it is? This tree doesn't grow in Nebraska. It doesn't grow in Michigan. So when I take people out, I ask them, well, so this tree grows on the coast in the Carolinas, Florida, on the Gulf Coast, but it doesn't grow in Kansas or Colorado. So why? What do we get here that they don't get there? And since you're not with me out in the woods, I can't tease you and make fun of why you can't give me an answer because I can't hear you. We get hurricanes. They don't get hurricanes. This tree has a dome shape. It looks like if you stand back and look at old live oaks, they're from ground up and down to the ground, a nice dome shape, which is perfectly well suited to be aerodynamically resistant to hurricane strength winds. Plus, it's got a big root system that goes sideways generally and helps stabilize it, especially if it's in softer soil. So it's going to grow on the coast in places where your pine trees or some of your oaks are a lot more apt to get blown down. The other thing about live oaks is you'll seldom see in nature just one live oak, unless farmers or somebody have cut the other ones down. They grow in groves, and those groves are mutually reinforcing. So you get a super dome that makes it extremely hurricane resistant. The wood is really tough. If you've ever been on vacation in Maryland and go to Baltimore and you see one of the first ships the US Navy ever made, Old Ironsides, USS Constitution. It was named by the crew the Old Ironsides because British cannonballs bounced off of it because it was made of really tough wood. In fact, it was made of live oak. It was such an important wood that the US Navy bought wood lots just so they could have a protected source of live oak. In case you're wondering what happens to your tax money these days, I want to assure you the US Navy still owns those wood lots to this day. So if we have to build sailing ships, we're in good shape. The winged elm. I couldn't figure out a natural picture to show you. Elms, a fairly common tree in America. Dutch elm disease has destroyed an awful lot of them, but the winged elm grows really well down here in the South and is highly resistant to Dutch elm disease. And the winged elm name comes from this. If you look on the branches and part of the trunk of any winged elm, you'll see these sort of corky growths on the side. Many, many, many times I've had people ask me, is there a fungus growing on the tree, or does it have some sort of disease? No, this is the way the tree grows. But you say, John, plants ain't stupid. Why is this plant wasting energy growing these sort of hideous growths? Nobody really had an answer to that until about 15 years ago. And then some dude figured it out. And I think he must have been a guy who was a shade tree auto mechanic. If you've ever popped the hood on a car, you see the radiator where you have a bunch of metal fins, which is used to help cool the liquid that cools your engine, unless you have a really old Volkswagen Beetle, which is air cooled. But to the winged elm, it's not coincidental this elm tree does great in the south where it's hot. What this plant has done is learned how to grow radiators. These winged surfaces increase the surface area of the plant and allow it to dispose of heat much more efficiently. So you've got a plant here that didn't figure out how to grow poison or thorns, but figured out how to grow in the heat where other elms had a hard time. This plant is not stupid. I just threw this in because we all encounter YAUPON holly every day. There's a lot to be said about YAUPON. It is invasive, it's native. My grandchildren call it the Christmas plant because it puts out the pretty berries. It feeds tons of birds, tons of animals. It was restrained in Texas history because of fire. It's extremely high in oil, so it's an under canopy small tree, a bush that is kept in check by fire. Otherwise, it just keeps growing. Now, my friends down the Gulf Coast probably see this, but those of us in the piney woods run into palmetto. Palmetto grows in the under canopies, in the wetlands. In fact, it's a primary indicator of a wetlands. But what's that shape of the leaves for? How come? Well, it's an under canopy, and it's in an area that floods. If you left, say, a bed sheet out in the swamp, and it got flooded, when the flood went down, it'd be all crumpled up. It'd be muddy. It'd be covered in a wad. The plant needs to get its leaf surface out because it's underneath bigger trees. So it needs to capture all the sunlight it can get. So what it's done is grow in a way that's sort of like a collapsible fan. It can get covered by water, pushed by currents, and very quickly pop back out to get its leaves out to where it can capture sunlight. It's got a trunk, you just can't see it. Its stem or trunk grows underground. So the only thing that's up for the floodwaters to hit is the vegetation that it needs to make energy. Sorry for the out of focus picture, but if you walk in the woods anywhere around here, you'll find the American beautyberry bush, which is really cool. It produces these beautiful fruits all summer long. People make pies, jelly out of it. There's about 50 songbirds that eat it, deer eat the plant. You can crush the leaves and make a very good insect repellent out of it. Good if you're caught out with no mosquito repellent. But what I think is even cooler is the plant, the vegetation itself, has as much protein as a power bar you buy at Kroger's or HEB. In the spring, these leaves right here can have up to 17% protein. And even in the fall, they'll have 7%. So you've got a beautiful looking plant that is incredibly nutritious. Speaking of which, I know at least one person on this call likes to drink wine. People see grapevines all over, and then when they see the fruit, a lot of times they'll say, gee, that looks just like real grapes. Well, that's because it is real grapes. We've got at least 9 species of grapes around here, of which Muscadine and Mustang are probably the 2 most common. But the Muscadine grape is very plural. Can't even talk now. It grows very heavily July through September. It makes a lot of grapes, high sugar content. So a lot of animals, birds eat it. Humans have been making wine out of it since the Spanish were doing it down in St. Augustine in around 1550. So I had a grandmother who liked Muscadine wine. She can have all of it she wants because I don't care for it. It's pretty heavy, but it's a great native plant, and no, it will not smother the woods. Here's one that you've probably torn your hands on. And just about everybody I know goes in the woods, gets ripped up by greenbrier, because look at those thorns. Greenbrier are pretty cool. If you've ever tried to get them out of your yard or somewhere, you know that they grow from a big tuber. It looks like a sweet potato. And in fact, that's pretty much what it is. It's starch. Native Americans, I know the Houma Indians ground that tuber up and made flour out of it. They used it in stews and pan breads. The Comanches used the big species to roll smoking tobacco in, but then the Comanche were known to be incredibly tough people. The Muskogee women would grind it up, and sort of like a aloe vera, they would use it as face moisturizer to keep their dainty complexions. But we've got 15 to 20 species of this in North America. This one's the most common around here, catbrier. But this is another thing I want you to look at the next time you go out in the woods. It's all of these species have a lot of thorns, different sizes, until you follow that vine up about 6, 7 feet off the ground, and you'll notice it stops making thorns. Well, greenbrier ain't stupid either. Once it's high enough to be out of the reach of deer, it's going to quit wasting energy to make thorns. So, interesting plant. And here's one you know. I actually have a neighbor who doesn't know what this is and thought grapes were poison ivy, and I didn't tell him otherwise because I didn't want him to go chop down a bunch of trees, so I let him think they were covered with poison ivy. But everybody knows it on the ground. Here's a reason you want to watch what you lean against when you're in the woods. Everybody's heard the phrase we teach kids, leaves of 3, let it be. Well, another good one is hairy is scary. Poison ivy can grow very, very long. I think it can get something like 50 yards. The stems are the only vine that I know of that will grow out at a 90-degree angle. It's got a very heavy, hairy stem on the tree. So it's pretty easy to recognize. Now, an interesting thing about poison ivy is if you get into a debate with some of your acquaintances about global warming, I have an acquaintance who insists to me that global warming will hurt some species and it will help other ones. And that's true. A study by the University of Georgia has shown since 1960, the poison ivy compound, urushiol oil, is about twice as potent as it was in the 1960s now. It loves the higher levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that we've created. So speaking of that oil, that's what causes the rash. Urushiol oil can stay on your dog or your boots and be effective for almost a year. All right, let's get out of here. So if you go a few special places, you'll see fields of native grasses. This is a bluestem. what most people don't know is this is what Texas looked like before the Europeans arrived. 90% of Texas was grassland. The old saying was it was knee-high to a man on a horse. And there were two reasons it was grassland and not forested woods. And again, you not being here in person, we can't play 20 questions. What kept the shrubbery out and the woods out was fire. Now think of a brush fire that was, 200 or 300 miles long. So big fires kept down other vegetation, and bison. Think 1 million bison growing everything to the ground. Well, how come they didn't hurt the native grasses and yet they kept everything else going? That's why. Native grasses have huge root systems that go very deep. Some go, what would be, I guess, twice as deep as the picture of the man holding this one. And you can see the little oval shows what domestic wheat does compared to a native bunch grass. So native plants, native grasses, bison, fire, zip, go over them, they don't care, they go right back. And another side benefit is they kept the soil loose so rainfall could seep down and replenish the aquifer. So anytime you see a plant, be it a stupid little grass or some green thorny thing, ask yourself why. What's special about this? Why is it here? And so we've just touched on a few things. So I will stop sharing and hop this back over to Suzanne.
Thank you, John. Let's get right into questions. We have one from Steve Ellison that I'll read to you, John. Regards to winged elm, why do they not grow fins? I assume that means like the wings above the height that a deer can eat if the fins are for cooling. Is it not more likely that they are a deer deterrent, rather like the spiny holly leaves at lower heights that don't have spines above deer height?
Okay, I probably confused you with that one. The winged elm does continue to grow the corky growths. It does not use the wings as a defense mechanism. So even if it's 10 or 15 feet up, the winged elm will have the corky growths on its branches. It's also, by the way, not the only plant to adapt that. If you look at a young sweet gum tree, a lot of young sweet gums will have that sort of corky growth, but they will lose that as the tree becomes more mature. So in contrast to the plants that grow the thorns, the winged elm will stay winged for the duration of its lifetime.
All right. Another question, if you don't mind, I'm just going to hop into these. And also, if you have a question, you can unmute yourself and ask it, or you can send it in the chat and I'll read it out. From Bill Bass, is winged elm the same as cedar elm, or is winged elm the correct name?
It's two different plants. They can look very similar. Cedar elm is a little more rare here. It's going to be more common up towards the hill country. It's tough to distinguish those two, but cedar elm does not tend to be as corky.
Well, the cedar elm has like a sandpaper leaf, and it doesn't have a compound leaf. So.
And that too.
that's the best way. Yeah. Elisa Klein asks, does a fringed elm use the same strategy?
I'm not familiar with it.
Yeah, I don't think I am either.
It's ornamental. They're using it more and more on public parks. It's a beautiful tree. Looks a bit like a crepe myrtle in the distance, but it has those flanges on it.
Are you talking about is that the same thing as a Chinese elm?
I do not know.
Okay, because yeah, fringed elm I am not familiar with, but Chinese elm is a common ornamental elm.
That's probably the same thing.
I've never seen it on a Chinese elm. That's also called a lacebark elm. I've never seen that.
Okay, I thought I had. Maybe I'm thinking of another tree. Thank you.
Carol asked, does poison ivy sometimes have more than 3 leaves?
Not to my knowledge. A lot of people confuse it um, with multiple other plants that do. I just had a brain freeze. One that gets 5.
Trumpet creeper?
Yeah, not trumpet creeper. The
Virginia creeper?
Yeah, Virginia creeper, and all. There's a multitude of them that can kind of look the same, but poison ivy is going to be the one with the 3 leaves. The other reason is if you look, and let me see if I can jump back to, did I go back to my screen share to get to the PowerPoint? Let's try that.
Yeah.
Okay, so if you, if you look on the poison ivy, it invariably, unless it's been chewed up, will have what's called mittens. The 2 outer leaves have sort of thumbs where they're non-symmetrical, and the middle one will be symmetrical. So.
A question from Karen. What does poison oak look like? Isn't it fairly common here in Texas?
It is not particularly common, at least not here in East Texas. We do get some poison sumac, which is sort of bushy, and frankly, I have a very difficult time identifying just because it's kind of rare. Really, the only thing that I worry about is poison ivy.
Yeah, poison oak in terms of where we are is pretty uncommon. In some of the deep East Texas areas, you can get poison oak, and it has the same leaves of 3. It's in the same genus, Toxicodendron, and it just looks like white oak leaves, 3 white oak leaves, rather than the poison ivy leaves. But here, you're more likely to see poison ivy. All right. Any other questions? Now is the chance to get your questions in for John. Elisa Klein asks, how big is the trunk of a palmetto?
If you go to a stand of palmetto and find a kind of full-grown one and dig around it, you'll see you've got what's called the crown, which will be about 8 inches. And then you dig under the crown and you might find 3 to 4 inch, maybe 3 inches. It's sort of very fibrous. It's very tough to cut. The trail crew knows that. You can whack it with a Pulaski, and it's sort of like super tough celery. So if you cut it, if you get down to ground level, your best bet's going to be a heavy duty pair of loppers.
Does it extend a great deal underground? Like, is there a tree under there, or is it just, it doesn't really have a trunk?
It has what you would call a stem. So you can actually follow the stem down into a root system. Why you would want to do that, I have no idea.
How long is that stem?
It's going to depend on the maturity of the plant, obviously. From what I've read, it might be down in the muck about 6 feet. I've never bothered to dig more than about 8 inches down to kill one.
All right. Jill asked, are palmetto a really old species? I think I saw them on Jurassic Park.
Well, then it must be true. Ask my grandchildren.
Yeah.
They are related to very old herbaceous species. Remember, this part of the world particularly was a swamp. After it stopped, it was a swamp, then it was an ocean bottom. And so you would have seen 60 million years ago, you would have seen plants that looked very much like the palmetto. Again, a PhD botanist would want to argue with me about the exact Latin, but if it looks like one, it is one.
Dave asks, any story about the dogwood? They look fantastic in the spring, but they really grab attention. Might that not work against them?
Actually, it works for them. The only reason a plant has color at all, if you think about it, it's trying to attract attention. So when the tree is trying to get pollinated, it's in competition with every other plant in the spring season that's trying to get pollinated. That's why some plants pollinate at different times of the year, which means they have different flowers, because they're trying to not compete with the crowd. But the dogwood is competing with the crowd in the springtime, and it's an under canopy tree. So it's got to be kind of showy in order to get the pollinators to pay attention to it. You know, it's all about advertising.
That's right. Jamie says, I'm a little confused. I think I heard you say that YAUPON is invasive.
Yeah, again, when you use the term invasive, a lot of people confuse that with the non-native invasives. So you have non-native invasives, which would be Chinese tallow, Japanese climbing fern, that sort of thing. And you have native invasives, which means it's a plant that if you don't control, it's going to take over. Those of you that have flower gardens know that there are certain flowers that you love and think are great, but they're just going to take over the whole garden if you don't keep them under control. YAUPON is like that in nature. It's from here, it's a native, but it will, these thickets of YAUPON that you see down along Spring Creek, you would not see that in nature, because fire would have kept it under control, gone through there, taken out the YAUPON, wouldn't have hurt the mature trees. But I don't know why my neighbors are adverse to letting me burn the neighborhood down. So it's going to be invasive unless you go out and chop it down.
Yeah, just to tie a bow on that, it's not something that's going to appear on an invasive species list by the USDA, because those are focused on non-native invasive species. But another way of looking at it is a YAUPON holly is something that is going to require management from the landowner because it's dependent upon disturbance, like many of our ecosystems here. Jill asks, what can the YAUPON leaves be used for?
Oh, Jill knows the answer. She just thinks it's a cute story. For those of you who have just been dying to hear me try and say Latin, Ilex vomitoris, that's YAUPON. Because in the 1500s, a Spaniard was marooned on the coast of Texas. And 3 years later, he made it back to Spain and he wrote a book. And in that book, he told stories about how the Native Americans made tea out of YAUPON and drank by the gallon for 3 days. And in doing so, they had hallucinations and threw up and had diarrhea for about 3 days and hallucinated some more. And he implied or stated that that was part of their religious rituals in order to get these religious hallucinations. Don't know whether that's really true. I think if you drank gallons of anything, especially something with caffeine in it, YAUPON is the only plant in North America that has caffeine naturally occurring in it. So you can dry the leaves, crush them up, make tea, and have caffeinated tea. But given that Latin name, Ilex vomitoris, you might want to do so very carefully. You can also go to places like Whole Foods or Amazon, and you can buy YAUPON tea pre-made for you. Again, I'll stick to Starbucks. Thank you very much. But that's the story behind YAUPON.
And last question, again from Steve Ellison, is the Bracken Brown Beauty Magnolia a cultivated variety, or does it naturally occur in Texas?
That tree was actually brought to Texas on a freight train that came out of Wichita, Kansas. It had got there by a couple of itinerant Germans from Cincinnati who brought it on a rowboat that they got out of Boston Harbor. Wait, I have no idea, Steve. I don't even know what that is.
Are you serious right now? There is no way.
I know that we're short on time, or I could have kept going.
Yeah, I'm going to make a bold statement. Any tree that has something like brown beauty, or it's a cultivar. And so that means it's been specially bred to have these certain characteristics. So its genesis is Magnolia grandiflora, but it's been bred for certain characteristics, and it's a cultivar or a varietal. And then Karen shared with everyone, people might be interested to know that a major reason for the Great Dust Bowl created during the Great Depression was that the grasslands were killed to produce wheat. Government actually paid people to grow this and other crops which could not survive droughts the way deep-rooted grasses do. So that's a good example of why bunch grasses are critical to wildlife and soil health. And with that, we'll end it there. Thank you guys all for joining us. My boss is on this call, and so I definitely need to say that, you know, we are happy to provide this extension for people during quarantine. And if you want to learn how to get more involved with Bayou Land Conservancy and become a member, please visit our website. We're considering other topics like maybe frog calls or bird calls. And if that's something that would be interesting to you or you have an idea, feel free to send us an email. And let's all give a digital round of applause to John Stacy for a terrific presentation and a job well done. Thank you so much, John. Yeah. All right, so we will see you guys in probably June, and we'll talk to you then. Thank you so much. See y'all later.